During the American War of Independence, when the British Army would level their muskets to fire, the commands they would hear were make ready, click, normally it'd be higher than this, but I have a low ceiling, present, and fire. Now, compare this to the Continental Army's drill, where the commands were still make ready, click, take aim, then, and fire. Now, a lot of people will look at this difference, present to take aim, and assume that it's indicative of how these respective forces are training themselves to fight. The British, focusing on their dense formations and traditional European polite style of linear warfare, weren't trained to aim their inaccurate muskets, but they were trained to fire in these massive volleys where volume of fire is superseding accuracy of fire. Now, the Americans, meanwhile, didn't have the advantages of a large professional army, and they had to think outside the box. They're fighting an irregular war where taking careful aim was what really mattered. They used rifles, and particularly aimed for officers, because they weren't concerning themselves with social decorum and the so-called rules of war. After all men are created equal. But if you're a regular viewer of my content, then you probably know that this mythologized version of events is not really how most of the American War of Independence was fought. The rebels would regularly fight in traditional linear style, and the British were also quite skilled in skirmishing in the woods. You know, both sides could do both things, as it were. And whatever the words of command might be, indeed, both sides were most certainly aiming their muskets in battle, and they were pretty good at it too. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how you can aim a musket to start with, and how the British were trained to do so. We'll pull out some primary sources, and we'll look at some secondary scholarship as well in that pursuit. But of course, I wouldn't be able to do any of that without the extraordinarily generous the script says extraordinary generosity, and I went off there. Anyways, the extraordinary generosity of the Native Oaks stakeholders and supporters on Patreon, or indeed without this video's sponsor, MyHeritage. We'll talk more about all that later on, but for now, let us begin with part the first, the sight of a musket. So looking at this musket, you can see it is a short land pattern. It has all sorts of little doodads and bits as you would expect. You know, the lock, the stock, and the barrel and such. It also has, however, this little notch of metal right here. Now ask your average reenactor what this is, and they're probably going to call it a bayonet lug. And indeed, it does serve that function to keep the bayonet attached. But to a real British soldier of the 18th century, this wasn't a lug. It could do that, but that wasn't what it was called. They would call it the sight. Yes, indeed, muskets did have sights, and they were referred to as such in period examples. For example, actually on page 38 of his Military Instructor, published 1779, Thomas Symes lists the constituent parts of a musket for the benefit of the soldiers cleaning and taking care of them. And included in that list is the sight. And if you look to this diagram from a different piece, being William Wyndham's Discipline for the Norfolk Militia, you can see that the sight there is very plainly labeled. And the same book does have multiple references to the sight and how soldiers were using it to aim their muskets throughout, but we're going to come to all of that kind of stuff later. There are tons of drill manuals, treatises, and the like that all refer to this piece as the sight. And this is to say nothing of how on plenty of other firearms, like fusees, carbines, and of course rifles, there were often similar notches of metal that are too small to allow a bayonet to be fixed on them, but which were solely used as a forward sight. By this time period, the terminology, the idea of a sight was really quite common, even on a smoothbore musket. Sometimes, yes, the sight is going to double as a bayonet lug, but it is a sight first and foremost. That's the most appropriate 18th century term that we can use. Although in this case, for the short land pattern, it's only a forward sight, which means it's not going to be the best. For really proper aiming, you are going to need a rear sight, something a little further down the barrel, to make sure that the musket is lined up properly. Some pieces, particularly rifles, certain rifles, did have rear sights of a sort, but it wasn't as common, especially not in military firearms. Although what you can use, I've not seen any sources on this myself directly, but I have been told by more reliable scholars that they do exist. So if anyone has them available, able to give me a quote down below, I'd be very much appreciative of that. But the entire idea, the basic idea is you can use this little screw back here as a sort of rudimentary rear sight. It's on the tang of the musket barrel. It isn't quite perfect since it's a little lower down on the barrel. It's not on the same level as the lug further up the way, but at the very least you can use it again as a rudimentary sight to make sure that your head isn't leaning too far in any one direction. Like if I have my head right here, it's not lined up. I have to be more or less right there, my cheek well against the butt of the musket, in order to be properly aiming down the barrel. And I'm sure that the convenience of that wasn't lost on any of the men. I just, again, don't have the source immediately available to me right now. Again, if anyone has them, I'd love to see it down below. And if nothing comes out, then, well, maybe that's something that needs a little bit more analysis. We'll find out, I'm sure. For now, while looking at the musket itself may prove that, yes, indeed, it can be aimed. Like, materially speaking, there is enough stuff here that you can aim the musket. That doesn't actually prove that the British soldiers were actually doing so, if that makes sense. To do that, to prove that the army actually was aiming, we come to part the second, the primary sources. And if you'd like to see these sources yourself and read more, then you can find all of them posted free of charge at my website, nativeoak.org, in the library section. And starting, as you might expect, with the manual exercise. In its explanations of the position of each rank in the firings, at the position of present, it calls for, quote, the right cheek to be close to the butt and the left eye shut, so that the man may look along the barrel with the right eye from the breech pin to the muzzle. So it isn't outright referring to using a sight here to take aim at an object, but it is telling the man to aim along the length of the musket for, I would argue, fairly obvious reasons. Now, something a little closer to the mark, comes in the form of William Dalrymple's Tactics, published more towards the end of the war in 1782, where he suggests in the firings that every soldier keep his head close down upon the firelock, the left eye shut, the right eye looking along the barrel to take aim at the object. So adding the exact context that we were looking for there. Another reference to men specifically aiming at their target comes from everyone's favorite Cuthbertson and his Interior Economy, where in chapter 28, article 24, he reminds the reader that it must be insisted on that they, the soldiers, cover well the sight and constantly accustom themselves to take aim at some object. Using aiming in a military context was not a new idea. It wasn't revolutionary. Even as early as the 1740s, in Bland's Treatise of Military Discipline, in its description of the firings, he instructs the soldier to take aim at the center of the body. This was a common instruction. It was an expectation for a soldier to aim his musket and not just present it to the front and pray for the best. Whether you are looking before, during, or after the American War, you're going to find all sorts of instances where this exact same language is being employed. It might vary a little bit in detail, maybe even a little bit in the technique, whether the elbow is meant to be up higher or down lower when you're aiming, that kind of thing. But it's all getting after pretty much the same concept, which was honestly, I think it's fair to say, a pretty common piece of knowledge. It's a rather natural thing to do, is aiming one's gun when they're about to fire it. But, my dear viewer, hold no pretension that I believe these proofs are sufficient. Just because some manual somewhere, even if it's a government manual, just because a book says it doesn't mean that a man is actually going to follow the instructions. Just because they're meant to take aim doesn't prove that they actually were. militaries face a variety of problems outside of the way things are meant to be done in the manual. They face insubordination, they face incompetence, they face shortages of supply. All these sorts of things could prevent an army, in this case, from doing its duty and maybe having the men actually practice their marksmanship and actually aiming in battle. And to be sure, actual training in live fire exercises was sorely lacking in most of the armies of Europe. But before we come to that, a quick sponsored message for MyHeritage. MyHeritage is an excellent resource for genealogical research. With an archive of over 18 billion records available, they make it easy and fun for you to discover new historical information and build up your family tree. Now, I don't really know too much about my own family history, but through MyHeritage's search features, I was able to start researching right away with what little information I did have. For example, the only real info that I had on my great-grandfather, Freddie, was that he was the son of a rabbi named Wolf. He was born in 1919 or thereabouts, and as he used to say, when he went to Italy, he peeled the potatoes for the army. So I plugged it all in, and it didn't take long at all for me to start pouring through census records where, look at that, I'm pretty sure that this is him. It lists occupations, addresses, and other family members, all of which can lead to further avenues of research. And so the family tree may begin in earnest. It's easy enough to plug in the information and start seeing how everyone's all connected. But that isn't all either. Personally, I think that this is the coolest feature, the ability to colorize old photographs automatically. Just upload the photo and there it is, Grandpa's in color. Don't have to spend hours trying to do it all yourself in Photoshop or whatnot. And while it really isn't the stated purpose of the app, you can use that feature for other things as well. My first instinct was, of course, to start uploading some of these old photos that I had from my last World War I video, and actually it turned out surprisingly well, I would say. You can even use the program to animate faces, helping your ancestors to feel more alive than ever. Although I wouldn't recommend using your own modern-day pictures because, oh, it's a little strange. So, if you are interested in genealogy and starting to learn a little bit more about where you come from, well, you can get a free 14-day free trial to MyHeritage by clicking on the link down below, where you'll get full access to all these amazing features. And if you decide that you want to keep your subscription in the end, well, then my link will even get you a 50% discount off it. So thank you very much to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. And remember, everyone, that when you support the sponsors that support my channel, it really is a big help. Now, back to the video. So, part the third, marksmanship in the army. Now, if you want to get super in-depth about what I'm about to talk about in this section, once again, I must recommend with the greatest enthusiasm, with zeal and with bayonets only, where the author discusses all this sort of stuff at length, not only the training of the army, but also the varying perspectives within the army, and most importantly, the different popular military theories at the time. But for now, I want to try and keep this short, so I have another excellent book, Noble Volunteers, where the author is touching on that same topic, just not in quite as much detail. I'm going to skip around here between pages 66 and 68, if you'd like to find it yourself, where the author writes, "Firing with live ammunition could be a rare peacetime occurrence, but proficiency was soon acquired in the Boston garrison. As early as June 26, 1774, orders directed that if the commanding officers find it necessary to practice their men in firing ball, they may do it, reserving at least 36 or 40 rounds in case of accidents. The men to be marched to a proper place for such practice." Martial practice continued as well after going into barracks. Quote, "The regiments to exercise every fine day and to be frequently practiced in firing ball, singly, by squads and platoons, particularly the young soldiers, in all directions." Skipping ahead a little bit, we have an account from an officer in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, where he describes how his regiment was actually becoming really proficient marksmen, because what they did was they made man-sized targets out of thin pieces of board, and they then anchored them out in Boston Harbor for the men to take shots at. Again, he specifically mentions how they're becoming really good shots because they have to not just fire at a still target, but a moving target as it's bobbing up and down in the water. Other references to pretty much all the same thing, the men firing at marks, taking marksmanship practice, as we'd call it today, include the 4th Regiment, the 18th, the 64th Regiments of Foot, and also the Marines, all firing in a variety of different modes, be it independent firing, firing in platoons, firing by divisions, even going out in the winter months to make sure they were maintaining their standards. Again, this was not something uncommon or unknown in the British Army. The rebels didn't just roll up with this sudden incredible idea to start aiming their firelocks and then, take the world by storm or something like that. It's not like oh my God, they actually hit something. How does that even happen? How do we counter this? This was all a very much known idea, so to say. So after all of this, though, we do then have to wonder, after part the 4th, why didn't the British take aim then? And, well, I'm sure that there's a whole other study that we could delve into as far as why the exact word was present and not something else. But for our sake here, you may as well ask, why didn't they order level? Why didn't they order get hype, boys, we're gonna get some rebels? Why present and not any other number of commands if it's all meaning the same thing? Well, it's a purely nominal distinction for what is effectively, essentially, at its core, the exact same action, just with maybe slightly different flavoring. Again, the placement of one's elbow and stuff like that might vary from nation to nation, but it's all basically the same thing. The French equivalent, for example, to present, en jeu, according to Google Translate, it literally just means aim. But then the word jeu, which I'm probably mispronouncing, itself means cheek, apparently. So maybe more literally just like to your cheek or by your cheek, which I mean, again, you can see how if you are having to go from something more or less like this or whatever to this, you can see how it's bringing the musket to your cheek. That makes sense. I'm probably making French speakers weep right now. It may not even mean cheek at all. It's just Google Translate. But I've also been told actually that a possible translation for the command would be throw. In this case, they're not presenting their muskets, they're throwing their muskets out, which also makes sense. But ultimately, again, whatever you decide, whatever way you want to translate it as exactly, it's basically the exact same thing as present or take aim or any other variant of those words. So at the end of the day, my point is that just because the command is structured a little differently doesn't necessarily mean that the method itself is all that different. Likewise, some nations could be using the same words for commands, but then have them mean something entirely different. There isn't really a very strong correlation here, and just looking at the wording of the commands is not going to be sufficient to determine an army's tactical doctrine. Now I can already hear, of course, people asking, well, but Brandon, why bother aiming the muskets when they're so horribly inaccurate? And oh boy, that is a whole other can of worms. They're more accurate than you probably think, but there's an awful lot to talk about there, but I've already taken up too much of your time today, so instead I will just say this. Thank you all so very much for watching, most particularly, of course, to those ever-beneficent supporters of myself and the Native Oak and all that on Patreon.com. It's by virtue of their generosity that I'm able to actually make any of these videos. Thank you all so very much for watching, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.